Welcome to the University of Washington and the Office of Public Lectures special weekly series, Coexisting with COVID-19. I'm Hanson Hossein, co-director of the Communication Leadership Master's Program and your host. Every Thursday, with the help of some of the UW's top experts, we'll explore what could be our new normal as we adapt to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're doing so in partnership with the Graduate School, UW Marketing and Communications, the Population Health Initiative, UW Video, and my very own Department of Communication. This evening, I pulled out the wrong thing. This evening, supply chains, where's all the toilet paper? Well, we may have made it through that initial bathroom emergency, but will we be able to adapt to more regularly occurring shortages? And what can we do to keep the flow of essential supplies? As you registered for this conversation, we asked you to use the Thought Exchange platform to respond to this prompt. What household items have you had the most trouble finding? And here are the results. We'll be using Thought Exchange later for your questions to our guests. Joining us for this timely conversation are Joe Heim, Jennifer Otten, and Adam Drewnowski. I'm just going to pull this up here. Adam Drewnowski is the director of the Center for Public Health Nutrition and professor of epidemiology at the University of Washington. He authored the Nutrient-Rich Foods Index, which helps consumers identify foods that are nutritious, affordable, and appealing. Adam advises governments, foundations, and the private sector on issues related to diet quality and health. Jennifer Otten is an associate professor of environmental and occupational health sciences and a faculty researcher within the UW Center for Public Health Nutrition. She also serves as the Food Systems Director and core faculty in the Nutritional Sciences program. Jennifer's research focuses on food systems policies as they relate to public health and nutrition outcomes. And Joe Heim is a clinical instructor in the Department of Health Services and a research scientist in the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering. He's the co-director of the UW Center for Health Organization Transformation. Joe has held executive and senior management positions in software product development, supply chain planning and analysis, and market research. What would you like to ask our panelists? Use the Thought Exchange platform to submit your questions and/or vote on which questions are most important to you. It's important that we hear from you for the second half of our time together, so please do use that QR code that you see on the screen to share your thoughts. You can even snap a photo of it with your smartphone, or just follow the instructions on the screen. So Jennifer, Joe, and Adam, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know if you saw the icebreaker question in terms of what people are having trouble finding as household items, but the list is pretty much what you would expect. Disinfectant wipes, baking flour, pasta and frozen vegetables, meat, flour and yeast again, soy milk, and my favorite, web cameras. And I'll go to you first, Joe, in terms of, as you consider the crisis that we're in right now, as well as the shock to the supply chain, and you think about that list, what's your primary observation about this situation from your perspective?
Well, I guess when you're considering that list, I mean, those are items that consumers are purchasing, and some of that is due to everyone's becoming a big-time baker at home now, so you're looking for flour. Yeast was also under severe supply chain limitations. I look at the healthcare system, and in particular, I was surprised at the fragility of the supply chains and the degree to which risks that we knew about, this was not a surprise, but those risks were not taken seriously by people with the authority to do something about it. And I think it was evident that no one was thinking about the larger system, and that's really my interest. And that we, each one of the organizations, whether it's manufacturers of flour or manufacturers of PPE, were optimizing locally for their situation. The users, the demand was coming from a local optimization, and no one was really paying attention to that global optimum. And you don't get a global optimum by summing a lot of local optimums.
So Jennifer, Joe remarks upon the fragility of the supply chain. I imagine in your work you're seeing the direct impact upon the stakeholders and constituents who are affected by that. What's your primary takeaway from this situation currently?
Yeah, so my work is in food systems, and I think everyone's probably expecting me to tell stories about meat shortages or dairy being poured down the drain, produce being plowed under. But by and large, there hasn't been a widespread failure of the food supply chain. In fact, we've seen some of these supply chains come back pretty quickly, and there hasn't been extreme price volatility. I think the takeaway I have is really around the public health crisis leading to the economic shocks, leading to a food insecurity crisis. And so there are millions of people right now living permanently on the cusp of hunger, malnutrition, and extreme poverty. And that's what we're really seeing, right? A lot of kids are one school meal away from hunger. Farms are one policy away from having labor shortages. And you see families that are one paycheck away from being food insecure or losing their housing. And so for me, the takeaway is more of the relationship between this economic shock and food insecurity.
Adam, Jennifer speaks of this food insecurity crisis. I know you have relationships with the major players, both organizationally and corporate, as well as from a policy point of view. I mean, the head of Tyson Foods says the food supply chain is breaking, while people have remarked about Amazon being the Red Cross of the pandemic. From your point of view, there seem to be a lot of amazing shifts happening in your world. What have you noticed the most?
So my world is the world of research, and I deal with research in public health nutrition. And there's a realization that came upon us over the past 100 days, as they say, first gradually and then suddenly. And we are turning away from what I call precision nutrition towards more of a fuzzy concern with food systems. Let me explain that. So our precision nutrition was all about getting the right kind of food, knowing what to eat, at what time of day, and how to make selections. But the underlying idea was that the food would be available, accessible, inexpensive. And all those ideas are being put to a test. Food is no longer a certainty. The supply lines are fraying. Food is becoming more expensive. There are labor issues and personnel issues and safety issues which never really came into public health nutrition. We dealt with vitamins and minerals and polyunsaturated fatty acids, but we never really thought much about the food systems. And now we have to. And I think from that standpoint, it is a good thing for nutrition to take food systems into account. And we'll come back to the very important issue, and that is affordability and food cost. And again, public health nutrition has not really dealt with this nearly enough. It is time.
Well, Joe, so we hear Adam is seeing changes already in the fact that food is no longer a certainty. Given your focus on the systems generally out there, there are already forces against the globalization that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years. What changes do you see happening as we make the transition possibly away from the emergency to this new normal, where we're thinking more about the closing of borders, or at least more self-sufficiency in supporting our regions or our countries before we trade with anybody else in this time of shortage?
Well, I think that's, we always pay attention to that when we have a shock to the system. I think that the globalization system that's in place, was designed and tweaked and tuned to respond to the demands that we had seen as usual. And it made economic sense to have the production capacity where the production capacity was. And some of it is, there's a small amount within continental US, and there is the majority of it outside of the US. And it's an economic decision. So if we decide that we want to onshore some of these capabilities, some of this production capacity, then it's likely that it's going to be more costly, because we're going to not be able to, that facility in China, or those facilities in China, are satisfying a lot of demand all over the world. And there's a certain level of cost that you're going to incur no matter what the amount of product that you're producing is. And it might not be economically viable to do that unless we're willing to pay more, or we're willing to underwrite those additional costs that we will get when we bring it back onshore. And and it will make us feel more secure. If that's the case, then it's going to be worth it. We will make the decision that it's worthwhile to do that.
Do you see that happening sooner than later, or is that something that will gradually occur, that we'll see the cost of food begin to increase?
I think some of it will happen very quickly, and then some of it will be encouraged. There's got to be a policy in place to encourage something like that. Otherwise, we make economic decisions. And I think one of the things that we need to do is we need to make more information available to people that are evaluating risks, and they need to understand their supply chain that they are tied into. I think, you asked me what was my response and what did I learn from this. I think what we found out was a lot of people had no idea what their supply chain was. They were focused very locally. They were focused on the building in which they were in. That's where their materials came from. And I think Susan and Adam probably have the same sort of situation with food. Most people have no idea where, food comes from QFC. Toilet paper comes from Costco. No one knows where that actually comes from. So I think by onshoring, I think we'll get smarter about how supply chains work, how production systems work, and we'll feel safer.
Jennifer, if what Joe's talking about is this economic impact, which increases the cost of food, and obviously a lot of the frontline work that you're doing is in terms of people who can least afford food as it is right now, and then we're facing these shortages. I'm curious what, as you gather stakeholders to consider how to deal with this from a food and shortage point of view, what you're hearing or what innovative solutions are coming. And I asked you this in mind that one of the first questions we received from our audience relates to, I believe, some of the work that you're doing. Thoughts on food delivery, grocery services during this time, from local CSAs to Amazon Grocery, thinking about delivery and boxes of food and how farmers can get their surplus to the people who need them most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thinking about the self-sufficiency, this isn't, Joe mentioned shocks before, right? And this isn't the first time that we've had a shock. In fact, anytime we have a shock that affects the food supply, countries are thinking about how to get a food plan in place. They want to secure production. They want to make sure that food provisioning is happening. And after World War I, our country did that with the Farm Bill, which many people are familiar with, right? We really set the stage for how we would produce enough food for people to eat in our country, how we would get that food to people. And what you see today with food stamps or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is the legacy of those original farm bills. And so I think what we're seeing right now is that we need to update some of the pieces of the Farm Bill, right? So originally when the pandemic started, the SNAP or food stamps could only be used at the grocery store, like going directly to the grocery store. So anybody who was at risk or immunocompromised and couldn't go to the grocery store, they couldn't use those food assistance benefits, right? And so suddenly everyone realized that we needed a waiver, that there needed to be a way for these people to use those benefits online and get the food delivered to them. And so that's one way that that there have been attempts made to change the policies that we have in this country in order to assure that people can receive the food that we're producing. And there's many other examples of that, of changing the way that we're connecting the food producers to consumers as well. But that's just one.
So suddenly what seemed to be impossible is suddenly possible because of this crisis, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and there's a lot of questions right now about which one of those, which of those changes should we be keeping? Are these working better for people? Another example is the Women, Infants, and Children program that provides nutrition assistance to, kids between the ages of 0 and 5 and pregnant or postpartum women. And they've had to turn those services into remote services. They used to go into the office to receive their check-ins with. The clients would go into the offices, and now they're doing that remotely. And so, is that a more equitable way of doing it? Should we keep it? That's a big question right now.
So, Adam, obviously some innovative solutions happening where Jennifer is doing her work, and I know she worked closely with you. At a more sort of larger policy level, you're probably seeing some major disruptions. One of the questions we received, I think, might be specific to how you think about this from a policy point of view. Why are certain supply chains not treated as national security concerns? For example, basic foods like fruits and vegetables. That's an American national security issue. I know you work a lot with global entities. What do we do from a policy point of view to be as innovative as what we're hearing from Jennifer on the ground?
Well, interestingly enough, it's all connected. I mean, it has to be said that the fruits and the vegetables in the US depend very much on undocumented labor. And if you have an immigration policy which discourages that, look to higher prices. And then people who are working in Yakima and elsewhere in Washington state do not necessarily have the option to self-isolate or to live apart from each other in or work from home. So these are the people who are really putting their health on the line to provide you with fruits and vegetables. So interestingly enough, packaged foods turned from being junk food peddled by the food industry into the cornerstone of the vital food supply. So there's going to be a change of attitudes, the way we view fresh food and processed food and staple food. And actually what is being sold out right now is the staples, the reinforcing familial bakery goods and sugar and fat, as opposed to the fresh products, which are being increasingly in short food supply: the meat, the chicken, the vegetables.
And given your focus on the studies and research you've done around health, specifically in the neighborhoods of Seattle, what implications does that shift have in terms of our health as we stay in this situation?
Yes, so our studies on neighborhoods in Seattle had to do with obesity rates and rates of diabetes by neighborhood. And in fact, what we find is that obesity rates can vary by a factor of 6, depending on where you live. Interestingly, again, the map of COVID risk is the same exact map as we see for obesity, diabetes, and unhealthy diets. It's located largely in South County. So the upper income and wealthier neighborhoods are immune to a degree because their diet is better, their health is better, and it's people down in South County who are at greater risk. So we actually do maps and mapping of diet quality and health, and those maps are very similar to what has been put forward by the state and by the county on the COVID dashboard.
That's an incredible observation in terms of equity and how we have access to these things. Thanks for sharing that. Joe, I'd like to ask you very specifically about the title of today's episode, which is about that last roll of toilet paper. Given what accounted for that shortage, and what does that mean moving forward? I've been hearing even in the last couple of days that restaurants are selling toilet paper because nobody's going to the restaurant and they have a lot of that toilet paper available. So what's going on in the system that we've got this imbalance?
Well, I mean, the imbalance was caused by a shift in demand. So if we think about the supply chain is everything from the customer demand to the raw materials, right? So the demand for toilet paper is really fixed, right? There was nothing that happened with COVID-19 that caused a significant increase in demand of toilet paper. So there's some psychological aspects of it that, we feel threatened, so we look for something that we can gain control of, and maybe that's one response to it. But I think that one of the major changes was the demand shift. So all of the people were at work in businesses, institutions, suddenly are locked up at home. And that means that particularly, I saw some statistics on the people that were buying all the toilet paper. This gets to be a crazy subject to study, but and it's younger people. Well, it's younger people because younger people don't spend that much time in their apartments or the condominiums or wherever they live. They spend their time at work. They spend their time in restaurants. They spend their time at friends' houses, whatever the case may be, all of those places where they're not now. Now they're at home. Now there's this enormous demand for consumer toilet paper, and there's no demand for institutional and business toilet paper, right? And the ability, so we say demand is one part of the supply chain. Production is a big part of the supply chain. Unfortunately, you can't just flip a switch, turn a knob, and adjust the production capacity from commercial to consumer products. It doesn't work like that. There's different materials that go into it. So I think it primarily was the shift in demand, where it was coming from. And I think once, all the buildings in the South Lake Union get filled up with toilet paper, we'll stop. And there'll be, and what will happen is there will be an overshoot by the manufacturers because they're trying to respond to a demand that's artificial.
That's interesting.
I have a perspective on that, if I may.
Yeah, please.
Ask the question, what happens to the last roll of toilet paper? And my answer is that last roll stays with you always. So behind me, you see some toilet paper. It's actually special toilet paper from the time of the Hungarian Revolution from Stalinist Poland. My earliest memories ever is going out with my grandmother to buy sugar and toilet paper back in 1950s. And those ideas are still with us today.
Wow.
There's no reason for this.
And given that you've had that experience, I want to put this either to you or Jennifer, based on your research. People are obviously concerned that the system has been shocked and they want to give it some time to catch up. And one question we have is, are there particular foods we shouldn't buy to help the supply chain catch up? Would you or Jennifer like to respond to that? I mean, Jennifer, actually, let me ask you, I know that you have been speaking to these various stakeholders in terms of making sure that these holes are filled, and there is a surplus of food in some areas and there's a shortage in others. If you were to change your research right now to think about how you could address this pandemic generally, what are you thinking about most that you would like to understand? And maybe if this question makes any sense to that research, you could fill that in as well.
So are you asking sort of which supply chains have kind of been unhooked that need to be like rehooked in innovative ways?
Yeah, let's go from that point of view.
Yeah. So this really leads from what Joe was talking about. It's really actually not one supply chain, right? You've got several supply chains, and so you can imagine this as like a series of roads or something where all of a sudden, I-5 and I-90 are closed, and you have to take the side roads to get somewhere, right? And so a lot of these suppliers that were supplying direct to restaurants or to institutions, now those restaurants and institutions are closed, and they have to figure out somewhere else to go with that food. Many times it's the retail chains, but the retail chains can't absorb it all. So a lot, there's been this effort to try to relink some of the small and mid-sized farmers to consumers through things like community-supported agriculture, or you were talking about those food boxes earlier. So getting a fair price for that food and putting it in a food box to go into food assistance pathways. And I think, in order to make sure that we have a resilient system going forward, we need all those scales of food production. And so we need to make sure they survive, and we need to think about how we both, rehook those, get those roads going again in different ways, and make sure that there's, then what happens kind of after the pandemic. And I think we're still too far away from after the pandemic to really know how that might look. But it's a great question. You think about, the best example of this is in some of the smaller rural communities, you have these farm to table restaurants. And those are really kind of the hub of tourism a lot of times in some of these smaller communities. And those communities are really worried that the farm to table restaurants are going to go away. And then the smaller producers that are nearby will also go away. And what happens to that sort of that piece of hospitality that draws people into their community? So how do we make sure that something like that exists after the pandemic is over? So, both thinking about the restaurant, but then also the small farmer that was producing the food for that farm to table restaurant.
It's amazing that we are seeing the shifts, and as Adam alluded to, that it's really favoring those who can provide at scale because of what we need and how we need it. Our audience wants to know an answer to this question, which I think is quite relevant. Maybe, Joe, I'll try you first if it fits. Is it likely that access to things we really need is going to get worse in the coming months, especially this fall, as this shock continues to resonate through the system?
You mean access to things you really need?
Yeah,
I think of, when I think of access to things we really need, I'm concerned with the supply chain for the COVID-19 testing that we're doing, right? There is a supply chain. The final output of that is information, that diagnostic information, but there is a complex supply chain that provides the reagents and the instruments and the expertise, and that manages the flow of those specimens through the labs, the flow of the information back out to the primary care provider and then the patient. I think the other aspects of the supply chain, I think this has caused such a shock that we're going to pay much more attention to it for the near term. I think everyone is looking at how does this affect us and what do we need to do in order to be responsive to it. So we're thinking much more about supply chains, supply networks, and what the consequences are. So I think we'll be fine. I think we will have the products and groceries, and I've been very impressed with the way the grocery stores have responded. But I don't foresee a problem with getting the materials that we need or the products that we need.
Okay, great. Adam, I'd like to dig a little deeper in some of the other consequences that you mentioned earlier on, especially around maybe the future of our food supply and diet. When we think about this split between those who are on the front line of farms and slaughterhouses and grocery stores, those who deliver to, and those who receive the deliveries, where there's that dichotomy. As we look at the next few years, how much will this result in some kind of societal shift as those who are on the lower end realize that they're suffering the most but have to perform this essential service?
I think the issue of health equity and health disparities is going to be a very big one. And I'm really predicting that the issues that we now have with obesity and diabetes and heart disease will only get worse. And there's going to be a societal break in terms of people who are healthy and those who are becoming increasingly less healthy. And to some extent, even the shopping pattern has to do with income. It's one thing to go to a supermarket or a store twice or 3 times a week. But if you go to Costco and load up for a month and not go back, that means a cash outlay of a few $100s, which not everybody has. So then shopping in bulk, again, is not for everybody.
Right.
So that's a problem as well. It needs capital and it needs expenditures.
And that sense of that lack of equity also ties to what I'm hearing from our audience in terms of there's a certain level of guilt in that they want to stock, they want to go grocery shopping to feed their families, but they're concerned that how much should they buy, how much should they do that's not hoarding. Does anybody have a response about what is the sensible, equitable way to shop, at least from a grocery point of view right now, to not do the wrong thing? Jennifer or Adam, possibly more in your line of work.
Jennifer, take that one.
Go ahead, Adam.
Okay. So when I've been to the store, I noticed that QFC at the very beginning was actually encouraging bulk buying by saying, you can get this, but if you get 5, the price is much lower. So to some extent it was consumers, but to some extent I think stores were actually encouraging that. So the early stockpiling had the full consent of the distributors in the retail industry. Right now, there is going to be shortages. There are already shortages of the foods that you mentioned. I noticed cereal and baking goods are gone. The fruit and vegetables are still there, but we're having problems in Yakima and elsewhere. Yakima is one of the counties very heavily hit in Washington state, and there are going to be other issues as well. So it's right there now, but for how long? A lot of our produce also comes from Mexico, and again, there is an issue with COVID in Mexico, and I agree with whoever said that the problems may well get worse in August, September. It's not quite, we're not out of there yet.
Interesting.
And I worry about restaurants as well. Jennifer mentioned those, and restaurants may not survive, and they'll come back very slowly and gradually, or maybe not at all. That's devastating.
Yep.
Jennifer, you referenced restaurants in terms of the impact upon local economies and cultures. I'm curious, if restaurants don't come back, at least for the foreseeable future in the way that we expect, other than those intangible things, what kind of effect might that have on the food supply chain down the road?
Yeah, I think that in terms of just where the food system has been hardest hit, it's definitely, from the consumer standpoint, right, it's restaurants. From the worker standpoint, we're looking at slaughterhouses and processing. And And for food insecure, where it's this crisscross, I think, right? Of you were asking, how much should people be going to the store? Is there hoarding or whatnot? And one of the things I was thinking a lot about was there's both, buying enough food and having, Adam talked about bulk buying and having enough money to buy in bulk, but there's also sort of the exposure to COVID, right? So you're both trying to minimize that exposure by not going to as many places as you may normally have gone to, but you're also trying to buy enough, it's like to reduce frequency and all of those points. So just sort of thinking about the future of the food supply, I think there's a lot of unknowns. And one way I like to think about this right now, I sort of feel like, have you ever heard in the healthcare field about airway, breathing, and circulation? So the ABCs, when someone first comes into the ER, the first three things they check are airway, breathing, circulation, and then they sort of worry about the person getting well. I sort of feel like we're in that early phase where we're still worried about like airway, breathing, circulation. Is there enough food being produced? Are people getting enough food? What's the circulation of food looking like? And so it's really hard right now to think about sort of the future of all of this sort of getting back on its feet. And I think people are starting to really think about that, but and try things out. We've seen different restaurant chains try things out here with I'm forgetting the one that had the drive-through, but now it's takeout.
Canless.
Canless, yes,
yeah,
Canless.
Yeah.
And so I think everyone's trying out different innovations and different models, and we'll have to see how long this pandemic lasts to know which one of those will stick and for how long.
Joe, so it sounds like we're still in crisis mode. One of our viewers is really interested, since you're the engineering mind in our group here, what new technologies do you feel will change how the supply chain will operate in the future? Technology, especially AI, is disrupting many industries, and thinking the supply chain will or already is impacted. So I imagine if we have more data and we have more algorithms to be able to study this, there may be solutions where we can actually not have these shortages in the future because we can anticipate them better. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we need is a better information infrastructure. And I don't mean hardware. I mean the information about what the current state of the system is so that we can make locally good decisions based upon global information. And one of the ways to do that, and that's my particular area of focus, is modeling, and modeling large complex systems. And you can't build one big model, you can't do centralized control, but you can do distributed models that allow these distributed areas to make decisions. So the issue is getting the information to people, getting the tools to people so that they can make good risk analyses, understand how to make those, and then putting systems in place so that you do it. Because it's very easy to go along and not do anything about it, not pay attention to it when you haven't had a problem in some amount of time. So you have to put systems in place that cause that to happen. So I think the technology that we have available now, the information technology, is available for us to piggyback on. I think what we need to do in the future is to make the information available that will help people make good decisions locally, because that's where we're concerned with. That's where our economic responsibilities are generally within our hospital, within our clinic, within our healthcare system, within our local healthcare system.
So, Adam, I'd like to come to you for the final thought and the final question. Good decisions, as Joe said. You're focused very much on people and diet and equity and nutrition. One of our last questions is, what are some core nutrients that people are missing with the gaps in availability and access? And I'm thinking specifically about your research and what you care about most. What good decisions would you like us to make from a policy point of view and from an individual point of view with regards to what matters most to you moving forward?
Well, that is a very good question. So the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems released a statement saying, make fresh, nutritious food available and affordable to all. So I couldn't agree more, but how do we do that? The panel of experts came with that statement. How do we do that? The big question is, will we go to local or global, or will we go to handcrafted artisanal foods, or will we go to contactless food prepared by machines? And attitudes are changing. We're not quite so averse anymore to having food prepared by machines untouched by human hands. Will that be forever? Is that our new normal? I don't know.
Wow. Well, thank you, Adam Drewnowski, Joe Heim, and Jennifer Otten, for helping us flesh out the facts about the fate of our supply chain. I think it sounds like whatever happens, it's going to be different in the near future. So thanks for sharing those amazing perspectives. And join us next week on Thursday, June 4th at 6:30 Pacific for our next episode, The New Essential Employee. We'll be answering your questions about future career trends with faculty guests Anita Ramasastry, Kevin Mihata, and Brianna Randall. You can register for the event free of charge at coexisting.eventbrite.com. And we'd love to start the conversation with you now. We're interested to hear, what careers do you think will become more valued in the future? You can answer now by opening your camera app on your phone and pointing it at the QR code on the screen, or you can go to tejoin.com and enter the code 345-895-329. I'm Hanson Hossein. Thank you for joining us for Coexisting with COVID-19. I look forward to seeing you again next week.